Welcome back to another segment of the Bipartisan Policy Center's ESG and Corporate Governance Program. I'm Tim Doyle, Senior Advisor here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. The issue today is the Department of Labor's recent 2022 amendments called Prudence and Loyalty in Selecting Planned Investment and Exercising Shareholder Rights. This was an amendment to the 2020 Financial Factors in Selecting Planned Investment Rule. Both have commonly been referred to, at least here in Washington, as DOL's ESG rules. Recently, under the Congressional Review Act, Congress passed a resolution to roll back the 2022 amendments. This resulted in President Biden issuing his first veto on March 20th of that resolution. So what does this have to do with ESG, and how do the amendments impact your retirement? To help answer these questions, we have brought in an expert panel. We are honored today to have Robert Eccles, visiting professor of management practice at Syed Business School at Oxford University, Anson Freerichs, co-founder and president of Strive Asset Management, and Clara Miller, advisor, social sector finance, and president emerita at Heron Foundation. Thank you all for being here today.
Good to see you, Tim.
For those of us, for those of you joining today, please submit questions using the live chat function on YouTube. Let's get started. I want to do a little bit of set a little bit of the groundwork here for this discussion. Recently, there have been those that have claimed Republicans have come forth and said ESG essentially equals woke. That is, that ESG is based on a political or social agenda, and therefore is bad in their eyes. Now, the reverse, Democrats believe that ESG is de facto material or economically relevant. That is, that ESG is good. We at BPC have been looking at both sides of these arguments and believe that there may be a middle ground, and that is ESG can be material or economically relevant, but not always. Relevant economic factors considered to be ESG, which are dynamic by most people's account, must be assessed individually by companies, or in this case by financial advisors with specific fiduciary duties. And again, up until about a year ago, it appeared that only Republicans and key congressional committees spent much time on ESG policy, although many may disagree with that. Whether it is because ESG funds appeared to underperform the market as of late, or their connection to a woke policy, or frankly, the midterm election in 2022 or the upcoming 2024 election, or a combination of all of these, there appears to be a grassroots effort, at least at the state level, to object to ESG. I think it's probably important too, because ESG can mean so many different things to so many different people. Generally speaking, when we refer to ESG investing, we're talking about three broad categories. One is impact investing. In that case, the main purpose, or even a dual purpose of impact investing, is that the result of the investment would have an impact on something, be it social or political or religious in many cases, with also the point of having some kind of return that makes it worth the investment. The second kind, generally speaking, is an exclusionary or inclusionary investing. And this is generally described as either excluding or including specific companies or industries or sectors. And then finally, the third has been referred to by many is called strategic investing. And this is when ESG factors are used in conjunction with other risk factors. So that's kind of a lot to say to kind of start this conversation. So let's begin with Bob, with you. Wanted to ask your help to help set the stage for the current economic state. How did we get to where we are? What are your thoughts?
So thanks for asking. I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, as you said, 10 years ago, most people didn't even know what ESG was. As Clara was saying, you go to a cocktail party, you want to talk about ESG, and everybody peels off into the corners because they think it's going to be a boring conversation. That's changed. I think that the three categories that you've laid out are very helpful. And let me just focus on the second one, which is, kind of this ESG exclusion or not, because I think some of the seeds of the problem we've got, this problem of ESG meaning different things to different people. There's a group that's even to the left of me, and I'm pretty left. I'm not really, really left, but I'm pretty left. But there's people to the left of me They don't like ESG because it's not that category of impact investing. So you've got asset managers that come out with funds and they call them ESG funds and they say it's going to solve climate change. And you look at the fund and it doesn't have any oil and gas stocks because they've been excluded and they've got tech stocks. And I'm thinking, what does that have to do with climate change, right? And people go, oh, well, we're going to save the planet. And I think the planet's been around for 2 billion years. It's been through a lot. We got 2 billion years more before the sun goes supernova. So, we're not saving the planet. What our concern is shareholders and pension plan beneficiaries and society. And I think sometimes that context gets lost. And so I think one of the struggles we have and one of the struggles that the DOL has, and we'll get into this in detail, is because as long as there's this sort of ESG moniker with the acronym, because people read so many different things into it, I think it's difficult to have a conversation about what the issues are, but I think we're going to get there by the end of this webinar.
Appreciate that. Anson, I wanted to turn to you. As I mentioned, some have argued that ESG funds are in decline. And there's a variety of different reasons for that have been laid out. But I wanted to get your take on ESG funds, or ESG in particular, and what your thoughts are.
Yeah, Tim, it's great. And I think you did a nice job setting up even what ESG means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But I think one of the things you have to get up front right is we're talking about exclusionary ESG or inclusionary ESG. And in the exclusionary ESG side, I think there's been a lot of skepticism, frankly, since the advent of ESG funds, about those funds being able to not only do good, but also outperform. You have Cliff Asness, very successful hedge fund manager, runs AQR going back to 2017. He said, hey guys, just take a look at modern portfolio theory. You're able to maximize your returns and minimize your risk by having the greatest amount of assets possible in your basket to invest into. So therefore, what you're going to be able to do to make sure via modern portfolio theory is generate those returns, like you got to have oil and gas, you have to have tobacco stocks, you have to have timber assets. Those have to be part of that basket to generate the returns. And that's why exclusionary ESG doesn't necessarily make sense. Then there's the inclusionary ESG, and the inclusionary side is saying that, hey, I'm not going to divest from any of these companies, oil and gas or alcohol or any other things that people deem to be non-ESG, but I'm going to invest in those companies. And then I'm going to try and change those companies and change their mission to try and be more environmentally friendly or more social friendly. So that's sort of the second piece on the inclusionary ESG. Now, on both of those, the exclusionary ESG folks, they really did underperform really in 2022, and they started to underperform because you did exclude all those oil and gas stocks. There's tons of studies on either direction, and you can cherry pick any data you want to show, do ESG funds perform or do they outperform? I think kind of definitively, now we can say generally those exclusionary ESG funds, they tend to underperform. I mean, Vanguard CEO Tim Buckley recently said, hey, if you're Vanguard, one of the largest asset managers in the world, you say it underperforms, it underperforms. State Street CIO says it underperforms. Larry Fink didn't even mention ESG in his latest report. I think one of the reasons is it underperforms. So I think that kind of debate has been settled. On the inclusionary front, there's a lot of outflow even on inclusionary ESG funds because people are starting to question, like, are these funds even worth it? Or are they outperforming as well? You have a lot of the greenwashing claims that have started to happen from last year, where all of a sudden it's Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank are being fined millions of dollars because they were taking funds that were just regular, plain old funds. Now all of a sudden they slap an ESG label on them. They don't really do anything to actually try and impact companies or change companies except charge investors more money. So therefore, people are starting to wake up to that. And then also people are starting to wake up to the fact that these so-called ESG funds, they may have been signing up for something that they didn't necessarily want. A lot of people have said, like, hey, if you're an inclusionary ESG company like BlackRock, State Street, how they do their shareholder engagement, how they do their proxy voting, and these companies are teaming up with firms like Engine Number One to also be climate activists on the board, or they're trying to do things like voting against management's recommendation for things like unionization efforts at Starbucks, or for like racial equity audits at Apple, which those boards recommended against. A lot of people starting to say, well, is this really the ESG that I signed up for or not? These are really contested public policy objectives, probably better left to individual kind of citizens to adjudicate, not necessary for large asset managers, and not every single individual investing in those ESG funds, the inclusionary ESG funds, is going to agree with all those contested social public policy objectives. I think people are starting to say, you know what, just take my money, invest it, maximize shareholder returns. I don't want to get involved in a lot of the kind of the environmental and social issues that are very contested and may have negative returns as well.
Appreciate that perspective. Clara, I wanted to turn to you because I assume that you might have a slightly different opinion on ESG and in particular ESG funds. So wanted to get your take on what has been said so far.
Yeah, I think Anson has thrown a lot of stuff in there. I don't think tracking error alone is the answer, which is what you're talking about with having a complete market basket. But in fact, ESG, basically what the research shows is that funds with ESG are actually, have similar returns to everything and anything else. But they are less volatile over time. And I think that that the main thing about ESG funds, and I agree with Anson on the greenwashing silliness. I can remember having a conversation with a friend way back saying, ESG funds, that's where we put the dogs. That was the Wall Street attitude toward this. The way the underwriting on ESG is done is completely opaque because there are no data standards for public company evaluation. And therefore, you have this kind of dog's dinner. Bob and I were on the board of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And that was the reason I, as an investor, a philanthropic investor, lifelong, and the head of a foundation and therefore a fiduciary, we took a look at what the data was that they were using to look at aligning portfolio along mission lines, and in MSCI, and it was laughable. And therefore, we got real interested in the data. And I think that that's one of the things that's created this kind of dog's dinner, is that the data standards, there's no alignment, there's no looking at industry verticals and what is in fact relevant to them. The other thing is time horizon, which I think is super important. If an investor is looking, in a pension fund, some of the younger people are saying to themselves, geez, if we're not looking at ESG, the market is going to go somewhere else. The nature of the actual risk to the business of this company is being ignored. And over time, those returns will be ignored. It will be eroded. Not so long ago, oil and gas stocks were terrible and technology stocks were great. And I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't think Anson or anybody else does either. But the reality is that these things go up and down. And if you're a pension fund investor, you're essentially a permanent investor. You're not only looking to the long term, you're looking kind of forever. You've got pensioners, as CalSTRS has, that are 100 years old, and as the head of CalSTRS once said to me, I don't want to hand the pension check to my pensioner over a scorched backyard in California with no water, and this woman can't go out of the door, because it's so bad. So there's a lot. And are those fiduciary responsibilities? Well, kind of. So I don't think anybody should be forced to invest in something they don't want to. I think that all investors should have access to material information. And what's being proposed out there it has nothing to do with the things that Anson was talking about. It really has to do with whether investors are going to get relevant information or not. Now, when I'm denied information, it always makes it more interesting to me. And I think that's part of that's the struggle for me.
Tim, let me just quickly respond to Anson. We'll get into the meat of this thing. So Anson, I agree with you on 2 out of 3 things. I agree with you on greenwashing, and I agree with you on exclusion. I've done studies on that. I mean, that doesn't really, accomplish much of anything in terms of solving the problem. And I agree with you on the returns. Where I disagree, and this would be a whole nother webinar that we could do, is your kind of imputation that these engagements are being driven by kind of a social or a political agenda, as opposed to an investment thesis that these companies need to have a transition or a transformation in their business model for, say, the energy transition. That's kind of what the Engine #1 campaign was about. And I think that's a good thing to discuss, because I think this underlying issue of what the dividing line is between the public and the private sector is an important one. But I don't want to hijack this, Tim. I know we want to talk about the DOL ruling. So let me shut up. Turn it back.
Tim, I'll let you moderate. I mean, I was going to respond to both Claire, then this is something Bob said there, but Tim, you tell me. Do I have time? Or do you just want to keep moving?
We have, yeah, no, we want this to be a discussion, of course.
In fairness, go ahead. Sure. Then we'll talk about DOL.
Yeah. So, the thing I was going to respond to is actually something that Clara said about, investing for the long term and long-term time horizons. And then also, Bob, what you said on the social piece, that's what it's really about. And on ESG, I'm actually going to go upstream from ESG to talk about how it's gotten politicized and also why you can expect to have negative returns. So ESG is actually just like how the stakeholder capitalism movement kind of implements its stakeholder capitalism. And for folks like how we think about the world is there's the stakeholder capitalism people that believe that, hey, the Business Roundtable, Larry Fink, Jamie Dimon in 2019, they changed the purpose of a corporation from one focused on shareholder value to one focused on stakeholder capitalism, making sure that corporations are going to take a look at all stakeholders, not just shareholders. What's interesting about that is you can actually take a look and, ESG funds, you can cherry pick any day you want, but take a look at stakeholder capitalism, which has been implemented in Europe for 40 years. For the past 40 years, you've had World Economic Forum, everybody else saying, hey, companies, corporations have to work together in perfect harmony to create the society. Whereas the US is focused on shareholder primacy. And you take a look at those returns. Broad-based European markets have trailed US markets by 200 to 300 basis points annually for the last 40 years. I mean, it's thousands of percentage points of now compounded returns have been missed out in Europe if you had just invest in Europe relative to the US because of this stakeholder capitalism model. And that stakeholder capitalism model, which is now coming to the US because of that Business Roundtable piece, that pensioner, Clara that you mentioned, who's going to live to 100 years old, now all of a sudden you can expect to have 2 to 3 percentage points lower returns if you're a pension fund right now, if stakeholder capitalism comes in. And then stakeholder capitalism, the tenets of it, it really is.
There's no such thing. What is this stakeholder capitalism? There is no such thing. This is a made up idea. There's nothing. There's nothing that stakeholders are not discrete. There's a stakeholder and a shareholder and a manager and a customer. They're all the same. They're non-discrete, discrete categories. So we're all in this together, Anson. It's not like the shareholders are over here and the stakeholders are over here. But I do think if you're managing a company, you're looking at a bunch of things that are material to that company's either enterprise value creation or enterprise value destruction. And if you're not focused on a broader range of things beyond what's on the income statement and the balance sheet alone, you are following a long underwriting tradition that included political risk, that includes, country risk, that includes long-term access to water. Pepsi, is it material to Pepsi to have a water supply? The E? Yes.
I agree with you on the material.
If you're an investor, do you want to know that information? Absolutely. Is it material to other companies, depending on their industry, to have SG, political? I mean, who knows? Every kind of risk looked at by the underwriters? Yes. It's not just financial risk. It never has been. And financial risk and those risks are intertwined. And it's especially, I think, strong in what we're experiencing today, because we have a smaller world and a bigger market and a larger population.
I can agree with you about materiality. I'm sure we can have a broader discussion later on about what is material for each company. So, Tim, I'll turn it back over to you. So
let's do it, because obviously when we talk about materiality, which is an issue of the DOL rule, and for those kind of then following, because we spent some time on this, and we're mixing a little bit here of the disclosure under the SEC rules as opposed to the Department of Labor rules when it comes to ERISA. And so I wanted to give a little, so we're going to kind of transition over into what DOL is talking about and kind of why we're here. And so for those that don't know, the Department of Labor, the rule that came out is through this acronym ERISA. And essentially it is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. So this has been around a long time. And it was meant to set guidelines for retirement plans, such as private pensions and 401ks in the private sector. So I want to make sure that we're, just so people that are watching kind of realize what we're really talking about here with these rules. We're talking about the private sector, how companies handle their individual pensions and 401ks, not public sector pensions. And I do want to also mention, I should mention that the rule deals with addressing proxy issues. Now, that could be a whole entirely separate webinar on proxy issues at the SEC as well as at the DOL. So we're actually going to we're not going to talk about those issues because again, that we just don't have enough time. So we're really going to focus on the ESG factors part of this rule. So to that extent, paramount to ERISA is that fiduciaries are responsible for advising and managing these plans, and they have a dual duty of prudence and loyalty. Now, this we'll talk about in a second what the duties of prudence and loyalty mean. It's worth saying that the courts have come out and said that these duties are the highest in this sense of fiduciaries. That there's no other higher duty than prudence and loyalty. So we'll get to that. But specifically, let's talk very quickly about what the 2022 amendments actually were or did, or how they changed the 2020 rule from the previous administration. And these will be just very abbreviated, so please bear with me. So they did reaffirm the duties of loyalty and prudence, which was unchanged from the 2020 rule and frankly has been unchanged since 1974. They made a restatement of what the current administration believes the ERISA analysis should be. And specifically, it is that factors must be reasonably determined to be relevant to a risk and return analysis, and that those factors may include the economic effects of climate change and other ESG factors. What was removed from the 2020 rule and caused some of the issues that led to the Congressional Review Act, the House resolution that passed, was that they removed the term pecuniary and the term material and replaced it essentially with a relevant risk return analysis. And those names, the terms pecuniary is defined in the 2020 rule, and material has a long, we'll call it judicial explanation. So those are terms of art, and they do have meaning that we can get to kind of in a minute. The other two things that were done by the 2022 amendment was it removed a documentation requirement when evaluating collateral issues in tie-breaking scenarios. And we'll talk about that tie-breaking scenario in a minute. There are many of us that believe that tie-breaking scenario in being able to factor in things outside traditional duties of loyalty and prudence are what are causing much of the consternation. There was also, lastly, the 2020 rule added additional scrutiny to QDIAs, and essentially QDIAs are those instances where you as an employee don't make a determination of where your matching funds, if you will, in your 401k go. And so therefore the plan fiduciary makes those decisions for you. And the 2020 rule essentially looked at that and said, well, if a fiduciary is going to make that kind of decision, there should be added scrutiny. That added scrutiny was removed. So in sum, those are what happened, or what the 2022 amendments did to the 2020 rule. A lot said there. So let's see if we can break some of that down. Bob, I was hoping that you and I have talked about this quite a bit. I was hoping you talk to us a little bit about that duty of loyalty and duty of prudence.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I think it's good that you turn to me now, Tim, because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a political expert. So, I'm going to dumb it down to terms that I can understand because a lot of this is like too complicated and over my head. I mean, and it's interesting, like you say, duty of loyalty, duty of prudence. I mean, it's been around since 1974, and that's like the highest level, it hasn't changed. Loyalty just means that you put the interests of the beneficiary participants first. You don't put your own interest, whatever they are, political, economic, whatever. It's the interests of the beneficiaries of the plans, which is their long-term returns. And prudence means that when you're managing these plans, you would do it as a prudent person, another term of art. So when you think about how it's being managed, you think about the expenses that are being incurred, you do so with care, you do so with diligence, you do so with skill. And to me, that fundamental grounding probably covers 90% already what we're talking about if you're adhering to these two duties of loyalty and prudence.
Yeah, and so Claire, I want to turn to you. How do you see those duties applying to ESG?
Well, I think ESG applies to those duties, is the way I put it. I think that if a fiduciary isn't taking into account things that have a material effect, and I use the word material in all the possible senses that you've mentioned it, and probably more. And Bob, for that matter, if somebody, a prudent person, doesn't look at this and say, gee, water supply is important to Pepsi, or gosh, wouldn't somebody want to know that how the climate effects are going to have an impact on my real estate portfolio, or my insurance stock, or my oil and gas stock, or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. I think that's the thing. This is about applying data, which has become so compelling and so important that nobody who is being prudent can ignore it anymore, to a regular underwriting process, and calling it out as, yes, environmental, social, and governance factors are having, depending on your industry vertical, they may be different. They're not the same for oil and gas as they are for apparel, for example. But all of those factors have a material impact on the returns, on the enterprise value creation, and on the potential risks to an enterprise. And investors should know. Not only fiduciaries should know, but the underlying investors who own whatever it is, the assets, the pension assets, should also know. And this is about disclosure, which is essentially the brand of US capital markets, global capital markets: disclosure, transparency, comparability, honesty. That's all ESG is really about to me. What you make of that as an investor, that's another set of decisions. But I think they're secondary decisions to, let's make sure that everybody has that information. And why anybody would want to not provide that information is puzzling to me.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point, and we've certainly talked about it here at BPC and on other events with Congressman Huizenga and Meeks, and specifically had an entire event just on what materiality meant, at least when it comes to the SEC disclosure, which sounds like you're talking about. But one thing does seem clear is that ESG does mean different things to different people and different entities, if you will. And that for materiality, something might be material to one company that isn't necessarily material to the other. And that certainly has been part of the issue with those that have been opposed to a prescriptive requirement of disclosure of ESG factors. When certain particular companies, for instance, a company, some of the large integrated oil and gas companies, that they have a lot of different sector verticals that they're dealing with. But there are certain companies that they only do one thing, and that one thing may be drilling for oil or
Right.
or gas,
that
and that's their sole reason for being. And so the materiality issue for that type of company, and you could pick any industry, and there might not be the same as for another. But I did want to get Anson in this into the conversation, Anson, because I'm sure you have kind of maybe a differing view on ESG factors and how they how you advise clients about how they affect your investment decision. So I wanted to switch to you, and then Claire, we can go back to you. Sounds like you got something to say.
Yeah. So one thing I was just going to mention, Tim, if you take a look at duty, whether you're a fiduciary to a 401k plan or to a large pension fund, your historical duty was to act in the sole interest, the sole interest rule, which was to maximize shareholder returns for your plan participants, period. And you were not allowed to introduce any non-financial or non-pecuniary factors into that decision-making, because you had to make sure that, to Clara's point, people could, live to 100 years old, and that's what you were focused on doing. Now, in terms of the materiality piece, I think you were making a good point, Tim. We don't think there are things that are material, that all these so-called stakeholders that are now bringing to corporations that are things that are not required by law, that don't necessarily have the exact same meaning in different industries, and are bad for a lot of companies. So I'll give you an example. The Scope 3 emissions reductions that organizations, there's a Dutch nonprofit that was started by a refrigerator salesman. He brings Scope 3 emissions reductions. Scope 3 emissions, these are, I'll just quickly go through it. Like Scope 1 is the emissions from drilling oil out of the ground. Scope 2 is the emissions that you are emitted by all the people that you buy your products from. But Scope 3, if you're an oil and gas company, are all the emissions that are downstream of you. So the Amazon delivery truck that shows up at my house, 5 times a day, those are the Scope 3 emissions. And a lot of these organizations, I know it's not required by law, are starting to put up shareholder resolutions and asking for disclosure on things like Scope 3 emissions, which is almost impossible to understand, because who knows what the sort of trucks are that Amazon drives, or how much emissions they typically have, and how much they update their fleet, and how much is being used on, of electric trucks versus non-electric trucks. So it puts in disclosure that, frankly, if you're an energy company, who really cares what your Scope 3 emissions are, because you are an oil and gas company. No matter how much oil is burned, it's going to be burned, and there's going to be emissions that come out of it. And I think you as an investor, you have to make a decision. Do you want to be in oil and gas or not? But for you to come in and actually force these disclosures on things that are not required, that puts an undue burden on these organizations, and actually taken to its logical extreme. If you're asking companies to reduce or end their Scope 3 emissions, you put them out of business, because just when you do burn oil and gas, that's part of being an oil and gas company. And as of right now, we need more oil and gas in this country, not less. And heck, 50 years ago, 90% of the energy production in the US came from fossil fuels. Today, it's still 85%. It might be going down, but it's not going to be going down as fast as people think that it is. And for us to accelerate this energy transition that's happening, all of a sudden, you're going to have to be making the decision. Are we going to want, $15, $20 a gallon oil and gas? And people are going to have to make decisions. Am I going to fill my gas tank, put food and gas on the table? Those are some other social risks people don't talk about when they're talking just about the environmental risk. But anyway, that's my
So let me,
Well, Bob, just before you begin, I just wanted to remind everybody to submit questions using the live chat function on YouTube. And then Bob, and then to Clara, because I know, Clara, we're starting to say something before.
let me let Clara go first, because I'm going to flip the switch. Clara, go ahead.
I guess one of the reasons that accounting standards and accounting is so important to this discussion is that I think Anson has a decent point. Companies can't be expected to continue beyond what is in their kind of zone of control. Not that Scope 3 emissions are always a bad thing to talk about, and it's worthwhile, I think, to the company managing its own risk to be looking at the bigger picture. Don't think that's bad. But if you don't have good standards for disclosure and disclosure reporting, then it is a mess. And right now, nobody's adopted those standards for the US markets. There is a set of those. The ISSB has the SASB standards, but so far, and many companies are just voluntarily using them to report, and some others as well. But it is a complicated issue. And I think that having accounting standards would go a long way to help.
So Tim, here's what I've learned so far from this discussion. It is much more entertaining and exciting and very relevant to talk about, disclosures and Scope 3. And I agree with a lot of what Anson said on that. I agree with Clara on standards, for having these disclosures, energy transition, but the Department of Labor ruling isn't about any of that, right? It's not about any of that. So I look at the Department of Labor ruling as I was trying to prepare for this, like, okay, the duty of loyalty, the duty of prudence has stayed the same. It says, you basically have to go for risk and return, risk adjusted return. You can't make decisions that have some political agenda. You can take into account things like climate change if there's an economic reason to do so. And what I've learned, and you've helped me with this, Tim, is that a lot of it seems to turn on, we'll do the QDI thing later, the replacement of pecuniary and material with relevant risk factors. And I'm like, hey, I'm good with pecuniary and material. I mean, I think Ron DeSantis sort of reads into pecuniary and says ESG by definition can't be. Put that aside. I'm looking at this whole Department of Labor thing. I'm thinking, okay, so the administration, depending on who it is, it goes like this, and then the political winds go like that. So if Trump does something, the Democrats all freak out, and if Biden does something, the Republicans all go freak out. The amount of daylight, for me, the non-expert, the amount of daylight between these two DOL rulings, man, you can't drive a truck through it. Maybe you could get a bicycle with a skinny person through it.
Right.
Unless I'm missing something. I just don't know what the big deal is, right?
Yeah,
So educate me.
Yeah, Bob, it's a very, very good point, and it will definitely transition us kind of into the next. I do want to talk about the tiebreaker scenario where you can talk about collateral factors in a second, but you bring up a great point, which is the as I mentioned at the onset, the removal of the term pecuniary and DOL, the current DOL, indicated that it had never been in ERISA before. However, the courts have used the term pecuniary in their holdings dealing with ERISA issues. So clearly, taking pecuniary out of the amendment to the rule, which would be the original rule, certainly that may look good on paper, but I don't think the term is going away. And one of the reasons I think is that in the individual states, as we at the very top of the hour we talked about, it is the difference between pecuniary and economic relevant. I kind of open it up to the group. I have some thoughts on it, but I would love to know what you all think, given the kind of the definition of what it was. And it's really, it might be even worth it. And why don't we start with this? This is what the 2020 rule said regarding pecuniary. This is how it defined it. And if you recall what I originally said that the new rule would or the new amendment would be, it's eerily similar. But it is, quote, a factor that a fiduciary prudently determines is expected to have a material effect on the risk and or return of an investment based on appropriate investment horizons consistent with the plan's investment objectives. Bob, to your point, that sounds an awful lot like how it was rewritten in the 2020 rule. So would love for the rest of the panel to weigh in, because I think a lot of people are asking this question. Like, what is the difference, and how are the two rules different? I'm sorry, how is the rule and the amendment different?
Yeah.
So I think it's a tempest looking for a teapot. I think it's, I think that actually, these are things that that are, in the best of circumstances, I think the difference between pecuniary and economic, that's different to me. Economic is sort of broad, and pecuniary is specifically about money and the money, the worth of the thing. But I don't think any of that undermines the essential meaning of ESG factors in investing. I think ESG factors, if anything, should be essentially integrated into investing writ large. I don't think there's any sector that doesn't have ESG risk factors and opportunity factors, and that if a fiduciary isn't looking at those, they're not doing their job.
And they vary by sector.
And they differ by sector.
Yeah. So Tim, in terms of our view, I mean, just getting into the specifics about what do we really think, with ESG, a lot of it gets done through either shareholder voting proxies or also engagement that actually happens. And when you're all of a sudden, you're right about this, there's a tiebreaker rule. There's really no ties in investing. But here's kind of the problem is that, I think Claire was mentioning this earlier. She believes ESG investing funds that they outperform. I believe that they don't. If you just look at ESG funds, you can cherry pick any data that you want to. I think this gets into the problem. If you're just cherry picking data, you can always have some sort of time frame or certain funds or certain ideology that is or will over or underperform. And so therefore, what are we actually talking about? Well, ESG, and why I think a lot of people on the conservative side are concerned about is, of course, there was a piece about disclosure. You don't have to disclose if you're being invested in ESG funds that someone has cherry picked based off of some sort of data that is going to, for example, ask companies to put in quota systems in terms of hiring that a lot of people just disagree with. And I don't think there's any evidence that shows that, hey, if you put in quota systems at organizations about who needs to be hired or fired, et cetera, that leads to outperformance. And that would be one of the social prongs that's going on. There's another social prong. I mentioned the unionization audit at Starbucks. There's another one recently, PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. They put up a shareholder proposal at Starbucks this year that's wants Starbucks to do a study to figure out how they can move away from using animal-based milk. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to us. If like there's a lot of customers that want animal milk, that want cow milk, that might not be able to drink soy milk or almond milk or whatever else it might be, like how is that actually deriving shareholder value? But so when you get into specifics of like what ESG and ESG funds that will vote affirmatively for these types of proposals that come into organizations that changes the culture of companies and leads to negative shareholder value, that's a problem from us. Like when we think about like ESG and what it really is and how it's really applied, it's really like investing in fund managers and others that are voting affirmatively for these proxy proposals and engaging with companies, asking them to bend their mission or asking them to implement like contested public policy objectives that aren't required by law and that most of the customers of these companies don't necessarily want, but it achieves a social agenda or an environmental agenda that frankly like isn't material and leads back this idea of stakeholder capitalism. Like all of a sudden, all these organizations that really don't have an interest in the long-term well-being of an organization, PETA doesn't care what Starbucks does long-term, how their shareholder perform. What they care about is pushing their own social agenda to not have them use any animal products. That's sort of the problem that we're talking about.
Hang on, Anson, they're shareholders. I'm sorry, Bob, go ahead.
Just ask a question. First of all, Anson, if it makes you feel any better, I drink whole milk. I don't drink, low-fat milk. I drink whole milk. But my vegan son was here for Easter and he bought oat milk. And there's some left over, but because I'm a sustainability guy, I didn't want to have it go to waste. So I'm having oat milk with my granola in the morning.
And you should. Hey, it's a free country. You should be able to enjoy whatever milk you want.
Then I'll go back to whole milk.
Or oat milk. I have no problem with what milk you drink.
What I don't understand, Ensign, is, I mean, we can debate these points. And as I said, I think they're good points to debate, but I don't see how this is relevant to the DOL ruling. That's what I'm missing.
For me, this is at the core of the DOL ruling. When you're talking about ESG and how it's being applied.
Understand how that is. That's what I'm missing.
So this is it. So like when you're going to put clients' funds into like ESG firms or ESG funds, a lot of these pro ESG funds, they now vote affirmatively for proxy statements that make sure that Starbucks is not going to use animal milk or that they're forcing unions into Starbucks, which is not good for shareholders. These are this is actually how it gets applied and how ESG actually gets infiltrated into companies and does have an effect on shareholder value at organizations.
But wait, these are shareholders who are voting. So, for example, in a pension fund, that's a union pension fund, in many cases, they're governed by the members or the beneficiaries. A union guy might want to vote for a unionized company in his pension fund. I don't know. It depends. But the point is, you can't say that the customers, don't want something which they may not want.
So Clara,
voting. Shareholders are voting.
Yeah, Clara, it's a really good point, but it does go back to the original duties that we were talking about, because the first one, the duty of loyalty, by its definition and how it's been applied by the courts, means that you can't put a third party's interest ahead of the beneficiary. Even if that might be a union, at least in the general, and this will be a segue into this tie-breaking issue, but they're not allowed to do that. It is for the sole purpose of the benefit of the beneficiary or the plan participant. So when you start talking about other issues that go into it, that's where the courts at least have come down and said, no, you can't. And that's the segue. And one last point.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just say one last point about the term. So, and I know we talked about the terms of art. So one thing that some have said is that the change of the terms between the amendment to the rule was the change from economically relevant and removing pecuniary. Somehow, some are reading this is to say that ESG factors, if they're considered economically relevant, is something less than what, for instance, the SEC considers or others have considered material or financial relevant. So that gets to factors that are less financially related and more closely related to social or political agendas. At least that's the argument. So, and I think that's a good segue into, I believe, and Bob, you and I have had this conversation, I believe is the most controversial or part of the rule, the DOL rule, or at least the part of the rule that many who are upset with the rule bring up, even though they may not realize that they're bringing it specifically up what it is. And that is this tiebreaker situation. And for those listening that don't know, this is more or less an exception, and essentially says that if an investment, a fiduciary is looking at two funds that are in it, again, depending on if you're looking at the original 2020 rule or the amendment, you're looking at this fund and they're either identical in the original rule or very, very similar in the amendment, that you can then consider collateral factors. So factors that you couldn't otherwise not consider. And this goes back, this has some history going back actually to the 80s, dealing with some labor issues, Clara. And then in 94, it became part of the guidance out of DOL. And this is the part that every administration, when it switches from Republican to Democrat, has changed. The language has changed. It's how ESG, and of course, back in 94, they weren't using the term ESG, but it's similar, they refer to as collateral factors. So in this case, collateral factors will be considered ESG non-financial factors. That ever since that time, each administration, subsequent administration has changed it. And this is the part, it appears, that has drawn the most criticism. Because it kind of plays into what the individual states and some on the right have argued, is that the real rationale for this rule is to use the tiebreaker exception to really just make decisions that aren't based on prudence or loyalty, but are based on politics or a social agenda. So I'll say that as kind of the background and kind of what's been talked about. So Clara, I know that I may have interrupted you, so I wanted to turn it back over to you. Just curious on your thoughts on this tiebreaker test.
The tiebreaker. Well, the duty of prudence and all of those other things that Bob was talking about still applies, even when you say to yourself, okay, it looks to us, and it's almost always a backward-looking determination, because they're looking at performance in the past. That's all there is. That then, if you then compare them, and then you say to yourself, but there are things coming up that we know about that will, have a direct impact on the performance of this company over that company. Those may be what they're thinking of as the extraneous issues. To me, those are part and parcel of doing good underwriting. If you're not looking at things that are about the bigger picture, if you're not saying to yourself, gosh, in another 5 years, in another 10 years, this is a pension fund for relatively young people. This is a company that is diversifying its consumer base. This is whatever it is. If you know about things and it helps you choose one over the other, and you're being prudent, which you don't cast your prudence to the wind just because you're in a tiebreaker, then I would say you're not doing a very good job if you don't take those into consideration. This is about underwriting. This is about judgment. And why would anybody want to exclude a whole class of information from people making judgments about their pension funds?
Yeah, I was going to respond to kind of, two things there, because I think, Claire started touching on something that I also think gets lost in this debate, where a lot of the people on the ESG side, they will tell you they're doing these things because they are in the long-term best interest, like the long-term value of organizations. Like, oh, I want companies to decrease their Scope 3 emissions mandates because we got to get to net zero by 2050. I think it's a real fallacy. Like, just saying something is in the long-term best interest of companies doesn't make it true. And it's pretty interesting that, like, a lot of, especially the passive asset management companies out there, they say we're not good enough to invest in stocks, or companies are going to overperform or underperform. But somehow they understand that, like, hey, we know where, like, rules or governments or other things are going in 10, 20, 30 years. And somehow
they're doing is saying this management seems to be managing their risks well. This is the evidence that they are, because they've been reporting data to us on this. And therefore, they get a good rating for managing environmental risk, because they're looking at, for example, water scarcity or whatever it is that is relevant to their business in their industry vertical.
Yeah, maybe, and
No,
maybe
it's
if it's
different,
relevant.
it's different depending on what you're doing.
No, I would agree with you on that. I mean, I used to work for the world's largest brewery, Anheuser-Busch. Like,
Yeah.
we need to have water to brew beer, but
Right.
there were no water, there's no beer. So that doesn't get lost on me. You know, the thing that I think like does get lost though is like for all these other issues that we spoke of, the PETA issues. Last year at Apple, there was a racial equity audit that a nonprofit organization, Color of Change, brought to Apple, that they said that we want you as Apple to understand how you've contributed to systemic racism historically and what you're going to do to solve it. And Apple's board of directors, it's not a very conservative board, recommended against this. They said, guys, this has nothing to do with shareholder value. This has to do with a social agenda and a social objective. And actually the nonprofit, they agreed with Apple on that. It has nothing to do with shareholder value. Yet somehow you have organizations like BlackRock and others that like vote affirmatively for these things. And so therefore, like if you were introducing a tiebreaker rule in, like you're looking at like a BlackRock fund versus, I don't know, let's be self-serving here, a Strive fund. and like, let's just be self-serving here. We would say that like now, if you're investing in a BlackRock fund, you are introducing social agendas into your investments because they are voting affirmatively for these things that are impacting Apple against the board's recommendation, where the board said this doesn't have to do with shareholder value. This has to do with stakeholders and appeasing all stakeholders. And somehow like now, because BlackRock votes for it, now it passes by 51-49. And now Apple's spending tens of millions of dollars a year, paying money to Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch to conduct a racial equity audit to effectively, tell themselves how they've contributed to systemic racism historically, and then what they need to do to solve that moving forward, as opposed to creating the next iPhone, an iPad, an iPod, or whatever else it might be, which therefore this goes back, this stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism model. I have no doubt that Apple will be more successful as a company if they focus on creating next innovation, next technology, focused on their customer and create things that are actually their customers going to back to, as opposed to getting sidetracked by these like social agendas that other asset managers and other investments are placing on them. And that's sort of where like I would just disagree with you about like, no, this is like really
I don't think that
Tim, wait.
Apple's being distracted. Go ahead, Bob.
So we're running out of time. And Tim, I got to tell you, I don't want to look like I'm a suck up, to use the moderator, and like but I'm feeling like the slow kid in the class, right? And I'm realizing that, proxy voting and, shareholder proposals is also sexier than the DOL ruling. So, that's what Anson wants to talk about. Good things to talk about. Clara talks about standards. Like, I'm got back to this tiebreaker thing, okay? You said something early on, Anson. I don't think there's tiebreakers, and these investments aren't in companies that are unit of analysis, they're funds. Where I think Clara is right, we don't have sufficiently granular, relevant, reliable data on ESG things to really be able to say that we're in this tiebreaker situation. So for me, this tiebreaker thing, I don't know why it's in there. Maybe it's just to create some political theater because the Democrats know it's going to go with the Republicans and then they take it out to tweak the Democrats. It just seems like I don't get it. Just like I think the difference between economically relevant and pecuniary and material sound like the same things to me, because all of this is operating under duty of loyalty and duty of prudence. So again, it's a tempest in a teapot. The rule changes like this and the political winds go like that. And the Wall Street Journal gets all upset. My people get all upset. And Anson's people all get upset. Your people get all upset. I don't even know what everybody's so upset about. Yeah. I'm missing something.
I think Bob, I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to like disclosure. Because, if Clara on her side, she's going to find data that supports that ESG is good. Other people will find data that supports that ESG is bad. But just disclose to your clients. Like, we believe disclosure can solve all of this. Because like with the DOL rule, the one thing that it did do is it said that ESG is material. And that therefore, if it's material, it should be disclosed, which I think a lot of people had an issue with that in the ruling, that there was no disclosure requirement. And if it's your money, and you should understand how your money is being invested, and if it's being used to promote PETA, kicking milk out of Starbucks, or Apple doing racial equity, and you want that, great. It's your money. You should be able to have that choice. But if not, then that should be disclosed to you. And you should be able to have the opinion, say like, heck no, like I don't want that agenda. I want companies focused on creating what I call real shareholder value, focusing on their customers, not getting caught up in these like social and environmental issues. And that to me is like what I think would really help solve this issue. If there was disclosure and people understood, if you're getting ESG, and it's very clearly articulated to you what it is, and you still want it, great. But if not, then you should be able to have that choice as well.
Well, and there's two units of analysis, right, for disclosure. There's the company level of analysis, which we've been talking about a lot. But in the beginning, and you brought this point up, Anson, You need better disclosure. Any fund that wants to label itself as an ESG fund, I just wish it would go away. If it's a material risk factor, it's part of underwriting, as Claire said. This problem of how these funds are being marketed. I mean, that's what's got everybody wound up, from the people who don't like ESG because they think it's not true impact. And these funds are being marketed as if they're impact funds, and the people on the other side that think it's pursuing a political agenda. A lot of the problem was created by asset managers getting over their skis and these claims that they were making about these funds. And I think your point about the fees being higher is a very fair one.
Yep. And I know we are now coming up on the hour. So I just want to get in a couple of really quick questions if we can maybe get a quicker answers because we are running low on time. Anson, this one's for you specifically. How does your evaluation of returns account for demographic and regulatory differences in the US versus Europe? Is there a quick answer for that?
I mean, I don't think there's a real quick answer to that. I mean, this is just the best data set we have so you can cherry pick any data you want. So let's just look at 40 years of data, which is a pretty good set, as opposed to ESG funds have only been around for 10 years. That's a very limited data set, and there's no standard what is or is not an ESG fund. So if you just take a look at a broad data set, we could go down to individual companies or sectors within the US relative to Europe. But I think that's the best analysis where you can just say this stakeholder capitalism movement, if it does come into the US now, instead of shareholder primacy of the stakeholder, I think we can all expect to have diminished returns relative to what we've expected over the last 40 years here.
Right. And then really quickly, Clara, this was probably to you because you've talked about this and it could be a little bit of repeat, but how will the accounting evolution change conversation? So what we've talked about, ISSB and others, as more and more material and more of what is material for a company, as accounting standards improve, will include financial statements. So I guess I know you talked about the standards for disclosure and what that impact could be if they are improved or passed, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we'll get some disclosure on performance. I think we'll get some disclosure on numbers that are parallel to peers within an industry. That will be very helpful to analysts. That will provide a much better set of ratings. Right now, the ratings are sort of thrown to the wind. And I think that the US disclosure, I don't believe in the dark vision that Anson has for the US markets. I think that because disclosure is at the heart and transparency is at the heart of US markets, and in Europe, the way the disclosure, the way the kind of regulation is going, it's about industries being good or bad. What the US system does, from my point of view, is to allow for much more innovation within an industry. So, for example, oil and gas would be, it would be a race to the top of starting to do things that are better from an ESG and financial ESGF perspective, including innovation, and that would be reliable disclosure data in the same way as audited financial statements can be, and would be available for audits from the outside. So you start to get data integrity and transparency in the market, which is at the heart of who we are.
Tim, can I just say, I know we're out of time, but I'm leaving this webinar feeling really bad about myself. There was a question for Anson. There was a question for Claire, but nobody wanted to ask me a question about the Department of Labor ruling. I had the boring part of this whole thing and nobody cared. So I'm depressed for the rest of the day, Tim. Thanks.
So Bob, what do you think of the DOL's amendments, 2022 amendments to the 2020 rule?
I think Claire exaggerated. It's like it's a tempest in a teapot. Thank you very much. Now I'm feeling better about myself. You saved my day, Tim. Thank you so much.
I was going to end on a positive note here because Claire.
That's good. That's good.
I don't want her to get the example that there's we have a dark vision. I think that we couldn't be more bullish on American excellence, American exceptionalism. We just want to make sure that the American exceptionalism has created, the highest living standards and the, greatest technological revolution in the history of our world. That remains for generations to come. And that's what we have concerns about, at least at Strive, the stakeholder capitalism movement, and ESG comes into corporations and we lose focus on the customer and innovation. So that's what I just want to end on, Tim.
We're going to have to leave it at that. I wanted to thank Bob, Anson, Clara. Thank you so much for your time today. Would love to have another. I feel like there's so many topics we could have another hour conversation on, and we may have to have a conversation offline to see if we could organize that again. One thing I did want to reiterate, and in closing, is that if you were really kind of tuning into what was said here, the positions aren't that far off in many cases. Now, there are differences, but we believe, at least at BPC, that there are bipartisan solutions. Maybe if anything, this shows discussion today shows the need for regulatory certainty, and I certainly know the business community would be supportive of that. And maybe not necessarily more, but more decision useful disclosure and better transparency in the data that we do have. And keep in mind that fiduciaries are, in fact, held to the highest standard. And I think that in the back and forth of this rule, we need to keep that in mind, that the 1974 ERISA law that establishes what those duties were of prudence and loyalty is paramount, and we should keep that in mind. Of course, we'll be following this issue as it goes from the final rule now to the implementation phase, and then quite possibly ending up back in court again. So as always, I wanted to thank you for tuning in. I look forward to bringing you another segment of the BPC's Corporate Governance and ESG program. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.